Good evening and welcome to the Natural History Institute Speaker Series. I'm Bob Ellis, Executive Director here at the Natural History Institute, and we appreciate you folks coming out. We also appreciate the folks watching on the live stream. I'd like to make you aware of some upcoming events before I introduce tonight's speaker. We have a number of art workshops coming up, and we're calling this Art Convergence. It's a number of workshops and speakers. So why don't you pick up one of these little handouts there in the lobby if you're interested in it. I think you'd be fascinated by some of the artists who are going to be teaching these workshops. We also have a talk here on May the 19th. Gwen Waring is going to give a talk on the natural history of San Francisco Peaks. Thank you. I also wanted to remind you that the Natural History Institute is a public charity, and we provide many free programs like this, like tonight's event. If you appreciate what we're doing, we would appreciate your support in our continued effort to do this work. Grasses are arguably the most important plant family in the world. Now, some folks will challenge that idea by trotting out the incredibly diverse sunflower family, Asteraceae. To that, I say wheat, rice, and corn. And then that same someone will say, well, how about the bean family, Fabaceae? They fix nitrogen. To that, I say wheat, rice, corn, sugar cane, and barley. Barley usually shuts them up because it's the main ingredient in beer, and nobody wants to challenge the importance of beer. So here's the thing. I think there's a bias against grasses among most nature lovers. Why is that? Well, for one thing, they're not easily identified. And the other thing is the fact that grasses have a completely different set of botanical terminology by which they are described. You have to learn a new language to identify them. And thank goodness for Debbie's work in this area, because she's written a book that will help us identify, help us get out of the weeds whenever we're trying to identify grasses. And one of the things I really love about her book is a quote on the back. And this is by Charles Darwin, which this gives me some sense of comfort. And Charles Darwin wrote in one of his letters to a colleague, "I've just made out my first grass. Hurrah, hurrah." So for those of you struggling with grasses, Charles Darwin did too. Now, this talk isn't totally about grasses. However, as far as terminology goes, but certainly they're a central part of the story. And so I would like to introduce tonight's speakers, Debbie DeWolf Allen, majored in geology in college. She's been certified as a master gardener in Harris County, Texas, and Yavapai County, Arizona. And she recently released this field guide that you can buy there in the lobby after the talk. And she is a long-time volunteer at the Natural History Institute, the longest time to volunteer. Her time precedes my time with the Institute.
Along with Leotona. Let's have Lee.
Along with Leotona. So help me introduce and welcome Debbie Allen.
Thank you, and for those who have been to a geology club meeting, which I think a few of you had, I'm sorry I do not have my train whistle. No. But I know. Different place. Well, this talk was going to be given 2 years ago, in April of 2020. Guess what? It didn't happen. So finally we get to go on and find out about the brothers Bouteloua. Bouteloua gracilis. What a wonderful name. It just rolls around in your mouth. You give it a Bouteloua gracilis. It's got mouth feel. If you're a wine drinker, they talk about mouth feel. And it's a wonderful name for a wonderful grass, Blue Grama Grass. Probably if you know any grasses around here, this is a grass you know, because it's so easy to recognize. What a distinctive seed head it's got. And it has the good graces to keep that seed head on most of the year. Through the winter, you'll see, oh yeah, I know what that is. That's Blue Grama, the graceful Bouteloua. One of the nice things about it, it's great for animals. It's very nutritious. It's very tasty, palatable, as they say. And if you look down here, those little roots down at the bottom, well, like most perennial grasses, it holds the soil down and keeps erosion at bay. And those roots keep replenishing, and the old ones turn into dirt. So it's enriching the soil. And about this time of year, if you look, a lot of times the seed head is gone, but you'll see these little curly grass leaves. And I don't know why it's Blue Grama, but they're kind of a silvery blue. And they'll grow out in little circles. So it makes its own catch basin, so when the monsoon rains come, it's got its little puddle there that it can save the water. Just a wonderful grass. But if you've been looking at Blue Grama for a while, you might, as I did one time years ago when I'd first learned about it, look at a grass and say, well, that's funny. Look, it looks like Blue Grama, but it's darker, it's heavier, it's something. Oh, it's got this sticky outy thing at the end of it. And in grass speak, the rachis extends beyond the spikelet by 5 to 8 millimeters. But sticky outy thing. And you can see it's got little hairs on top of the seed head, which is why it's called hairy grama, Bouteloua hirsuta. The Blue Grama is found, it's very common. It's found all through the Rocky Mountains. In fact, it's the state grass of New Mexico and the state grass of Colorado. Hairy grama is more found in our area, in Arizona, New Mexico, down into Mexico. All these grasses are found down into Mexico. And you might be looking at another grass that looks like Blue Grama, but it's kind of wimpy, kind of disorganized. That's Black Grama, another localized in the southwest, Bouteloua areopoda. It doesn't have the right sound as the Bouteloua gracilis, I don't think. Areopoda, what in the world does that mean? Well, it has stolons. Now, stolons are modified above ground stems, kind of like roots that go spread out across the ground and spread the plant that way. And Black Grama spreads more by its stolons than it does by its seeds. Its seeds are not super fertile. So the proper translation of areopoda is woolly-footed. Well, I first read it and I thought, Eris is the god of love, so I'm thinking of love feet going out. Whatever works for you. If Blue Grama is tasty, Black Grama is delicious. And southeastern Arizona and New Mexico used to be covered with Black Grama, and then the cattle came, and now it's much more spread out and much rarer. And that's partly because the cattle stomp on these stolons, and it doesn't recover. If you go to Willow Lake, cross from the boat dock, and take that trail into the dells, you'll see hairy grama, Black Grama, and Blue Grama. You can find them all right there, which is kind of cool. Well, if you've looked at those guys, there's a totally different grama grass, Bouteloua, and that's curtipendula. That's a horrible name, I'm sorry. Cut hanging. It's side oats grama, and I know you've all seen this guy. And side oats being the seeds, and they're along one side. Actually, it's always along two sides, but the little pedestal that holds that seed heads, for some reason they often swing around so they all look like they're on one side. If you go out in the middle of winter and you just see a bare stalk sticking out and you look closely at it, it looks kind of like a zipper. It's got these alternate sides. That's where those seed heads were hung. And that's very common. It's around much of the United States. And there are all kinds of Bouteloua grasses. Lots and lots and lots. Many of these are very, very local. Many of them more found in Mexico than here. I've got one here, which you can look at afterwards. It's Blue Grama. It's like a teeny miniature Blue Grama. It's so cute. Totally useless. It's an annual, but it's cute. All right, so all these names I'm throwing out, Bouteloua barbata, Bouteloua simplex, what the heck? Where did we get all these names? So I'm going to take you back to high school biology. At least I got this in high school biology. I don't know if they still teach it. And Carl Linnaeus. He was a religious man. He looked at the world. He knew that God had made it, and God wouldn't just toss stuff out. There was a plan, and so Linnaeus felt it was worthy of trying to figure out what God's plan was and how he set things out. And it was brilliant. He had it. He nailed it. He first published in 1735 11 pages of Systema Naturae. And I have these were big folio pages. We're not talking this size, but this is a picture of one of the pages. So imagine that blown up. And then he started adding things to it. And he would go out and say, okay, this falls here, this falls here. And by 1758, he had his 10th edition. He'd grown to 824 pages. He was a busy man. And animals and plants, and put it all into this. And that's the basis for our system of identifying plants and animals, which is pretty darn amazing for something 250 years ago, that it worked. And it worked because, well, it's basically based on the way evolution works. Now, before I get too carried away about him, I have my master's degree in geology. He also had minerals and rocks that he identified. That I had no idea. Minerals and rocks don't evolve. And it makes no sense whatsoever what he did. But hey, all the plants and all the animals, that's pretty good. So, basic, everything has a genus, species, name. And yes, there are levels above and there are levels below, but this is the name you use. And it's always in italics, usually Latin, and first name is capitalized, species is small. And of course, we have a commission. I can't just go out and say, ooh, this is an interesting looking grass. I think I will call this, blah, 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 blah. No, you've got to go through and prove this is a unique and individual species. And then your name has to be correct in the correct way. And you can name things after people, no problem. But it's sort of like license plates. They keep an eye. If you have a politician you don't really like and you name your slime mold after him, it might not get passed. So, and I'm sure people have tried. You are allowed to name a plant or animal after yourself. Nobody ever has. Is that amazing? I find that hard to believe, but no, you just don't do it. You got to have somebody else find it and name it for you. Bother. So, for example, a few years ago, somebody was out finding tarantulas, and they found all sorts of tarantulas, and they named them, you know, big legs, long legs, hairy legs, whatever. But this one, they found it was all black. It was outside Folsom Prison. It had to be johnnycashi. There was one I just read last week on Taylor Swift. They named something after her. But johnnycashi, that's cool. Now this is one of my favorite. And as the geology club, we had Dave Gillette, who was the head of vertebrate paleontology at the Museum of Northern Arizona. And he gave a talk, and he said he was out in the field up in Utah, and it was a long, hot day, and all he wanted to do was go home and have a shower and a beer. And this guy and his crew came up and said, "Hey, Dave, what's this?" And he gave him a bone, and Dave said, "No, you didn't find that in place, did you? I mean, you didn't find it in the rock, you found it in the stream bed." No, it was in place, and there were other bones around it. And the problem was, this was, I think it was an ankle bone, and it was the ankle bone of a land creature, and they were 100 miles out into the Cretaceous Seaway. There was no reason for a land animal to be out there, especially in a sea filled with predators. So they went and they dug it up, and they found this huge skeleton, I mean, very impressive, of a therizinosaur, and it was the only one found in, well, I think it was the second one found in North America. They found all the bones except the head. What an amazing thing. And they actually got to display these bones at the museum up there in Flagstaff, which was really cool. Well, we were in Badwater Ranger Station talking to a guy about this, and I said, "Wait a minute, you're the guy who said, 'Hey, Dave, what's this?'" And he said, "Yeah, that was me." And they finally named it after me. So it took some years, but now we have Northronicus graphami, so, which is pretty darn cool. So you too could, if you're out and really annoy your person and find a good bone, this is your chance. But these are species names I'm talking about. The genus names, all the good genus names were taken long ago. Sorry, there are few DNA showing things that, uh-oh, this didn't belong where you should, so this one particular plant or animal should be in its own genus, but the good ones are gone. Case in point, Gotthilf Heinrich Ernst Muhlenberg, not a German speaker. His father founded the first Lutheran church. This is the father of the Lutheran churches. His brother, first Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. His brother Peter, Colonel in the Revolutionary War, U.S. Representative and Senator, and Muhlenberg County is named for him. Son, U.S. Representative, and was a minister to the Austrian Empire. Another son was a physician. Gotthilf was a biologist, and he discovered and identified the bog turtle. So I see these guys sitting around at the dinner table, and Peter saying, "Ah, yes, that battle at the Revolutionary War." And Frederick saying, "Ah, that's nothing. You should have seen what we did at the House of Representatives today." And Gotthilf saying, "Hey, I found this really cool turtle in the woods today." But he got the grass genus Muhlenbergia named in honor of him. There are over 50 species in the southwestern United States. And if you don't know muhly grasses, you do know muhly grasses. Deer grass, great big clumps. If you're out hiking, you see these big clumps with a long seed head sticking up. There's deer grass and bullgrass. And then there are also these tiny little, the red one, delicate muhly. I love this grass. This is probably my favorite grass. You go out in the fall and you see this pink cloud, just tiny, low to the ground. And if you're lucky and there's dew on it, it just sparkles. And I mentioned it to somebody and they said, "Oh yeah, we call that fairy grass." So Gotthilf did pretty well. All right, so what about the genus Bouteloua? Where does that name come from? Well, the two namesakes have been described as botanists, Spanish brothers and gardeners, named by the illustrious Spanish botanist Mariano Lagasca, which is more about Lagasca, in honor of two contemporary Spanish gardeners, and named for Claudia, turned him into a girl, Spanish writer of agriculture and floriculture, which isn't too bad except for missing Esteban and calling him a girl. So there's got to be more than that. So we go back to the family Boutelou and their great-grandfather, and that is not their great-grandfather. That is King Philip V of Spain. And he hired Etienne Bouteloua, who is from Switzerland, living in Paris, and put him in charge of the royal gardens at Aranjuez. I do not speak Spanish. I certainly don't speak Castilian Spanish. I've listened a whole lot on YouTube, and I think Aranjuez is pretty much the way that's pronounced. So, then Aranjuez is south of Madrid, so that was kind of their secondary place, castle, whatever, palace. And Etienne also laid out the design for the royal garden at the summer palace at La Granja, which King Philip V had just acquired from some monks. La Granja means the farm. What? Okay, there you go, the farm. And that was his great-grandfather. His son, Esteban Bouteloua II, became the assistant gardener and head arborist at La Granja, and then became the head gardener at Aranjuez. And again, they're traveling around Europe, brought new plants in from Paris. Okay, now we have a new king. And Spain, I think, probably reached a peak pretty much under Carlos III. It certainly went downhill very quickly after Carlos III. He believed the value of his kingdom lay more in its lands and people than the gold and silver in its treasury. What a thought. I mean, we're talking European kings. They really didn't, I don't have that high opinion of their intellect or their magnanimous nature. But he was a pretty good ruler, and he was a strong supporter of the study of botany and horticulture. How cool is that? And he built an experimental agricultural station, which after his death fell into disrepair, like many things did. Now we're getting down to the Bouteloua. We got great-grandfather, grandfather, and father. Pablo traveled all around Europe and then moved back and designed the main garden in Aranjuez in honor of King Carlos III, the Enlightened. And that is King Carlos III. King Carlos was the first Bourbon king of Spain, and he was noted for having the Bourbon nose. So if you see the picture of the guy with the big nose, that's Carlos III, the Enlightened. Now, think back for a minute. We're talking about American Revolutionary times. You're the head gardener. Here's Aranjuez. And you can see we got the palace. We have a garden there, garden here. Huerta means vegetables, so this was the pond, wet vegetables. Here are the dry vegetables. If you're the head gardener, you've got to take care of everything for the court. So you have to have lovely gardens for people to walk in and admire these new plants and smell the flowers and all, but you've also got to provide them with food, with bread, with all the food they're going to eat. And so in January, if the king says, gee, I really like asparagus. Can I have some asparagus for dinner? You can't run down to Walmart or Fry's and pick up asparagus. If you haven't grown it, you don't have it. And I remember growing up, strawberries, you had them in season. But if the king wants it, and in fact, when we get to Claudio and Esteban, they learned to grow asparagus year-round in manure, so it worked. And asparagus was one of the favorites of the kings. And even today, people apparently travel from Madrid to Aronketh to buy the asparagus. So if you're a gardener to the king, you've got to know it all. You've got to be able to provide everything from beautiful flowers to food. And this is the father again. He brought in new plants. These are the pretty ones. And now we move, finally, to Claudio and Esteban. They were born in Aronketh, 1774 and 1776. Claudio lived a pretty good long life. Esteban, unfortunately, died at 39, apparently from an illness. And I think Esteban was the more interesting. I sense he was the more adventurous, more interesting of the two brothers. They served most of their lives under Carlos IV, the son of Carlos, the enlightened king. And I've read that, you look at that portrait, the artist wanted to make him look regal and noble and like his portrait, but at the same time get that kind of empty deer in the headlights look in his eyes. He wasn't very bright. He was not interested in governing. He loved to hunt. And he probably could have just carried on and would have been okay, except there was this little guy up in the north named Napoleon Bonaparte, who had designs on Spain. And he came, you see, in 1808. And remember, that is kind of the time when things really fell apart. So, yes, he was deposed in 1808. Napoleon put his older brother in charge of Spain. His older brother didn't want to be in charge of Spain. He was much happier doing other things, but he did it for a few years. And there was war across Europe. And then after Napoleon was defeated, then Spain had an insurrection, and things just went to pot. It just was not, after 1808, things went downhill. So you can see Claudio died in Seville. When they had the insurrection, Claudio left Madrid, went to Seville, where he ended up his life as a professor and did okay. But back to their youth. You can see when they were teenagers, Carlos III was still king, and the brothers got, isn't this sweet, 8 years in France and England under a royal pension to study agriculture, horticulture, and botany. How cool is that? They went to Kew Gardens, to Versailles, went with all the people who knew gardening and really appreciated plants. And when they returned, Esteban became the head gardener and arborist at Aronketh, and Claudio was the head gardener at the Royal Botanical Garden in Madrid. This is not what I thought Claudio would look like. When they talk about Spanish gardener, oh, okay, that's pretty good. And they wrote books when they got back. First, Treatise on Vegetables, and I actually have a copy. This is the Dover copy, which is kind of silly for me to have since I don't speak Spanish, but it's just really impressive book. They wrote Treatise on Flowers. Vegetables, flowers, got to cover it. Description of the species of grapes from the vineyards of Ocana. You got to have your wine. Varieties of pines. Oh, you got to build buildings. Varieties of wheat, barley, rye that have been cultivated in Aronketh. Wow, you had to know it all. So this book, the Treatise on Vegetables, is impressive. Each one describes the plant, describes how to grow it, and then describes how to eat it and cook it. And these are the plants it covers. Wow. That's pretty impressive. Now the ones in red were introduced by the Spanish from the New World. Strawberries, the Spanish kings, along with asparagus, decide they really like strawberries too. But the big one they brought back was the pepper. And I just ran into this one, and I thought I would mention it. It's a book on potatoes, but Claudio wrote that the potato is without a doubt the most valuable item we received from the New World, adding that the rest of Europe ought to thank Spain for introducing this botanical treasure. And there were a whole bunch of quotes about how important the potato was. I think the one that stood out to me was Polish statesmen saying, potatoes, the greatest blessing conferred by heaven, second only to baptism. Now that's a pretty impressive thing. So potatoes were a big thing. But meanwhile, back to the treatise of vegetables, and I'm going to read one thing which I painstakingly translated about the tomato. Tomatoes are eaten raw with salt, and although it is a cold food, it is nonetheless healthy. I never thought of that. Would you think only hot foods are healthy? The tomato is also eaten in various stews. It is used daily for sauces and proves, and I have no idea what proves are, giving it a pleasing acid flavor. Some people marinate tomatoes in vinegar with salt and black pepper, making some incisions through which the vinegar will penetrate. The tomato fruit excites the appetite and comforts a stomach weakened by excessive heat. I love it. It's just poetic. But yeah, and vinegar and salt, that sounds like a pretty good idea. Esteban wrote books on his own, experiments and observations on barley. I don't know if he got into beer. Plants native to Montserrat. Plants observed on the road between Barcelona and Monastral. Theory and practice of grafting. And in fact, I do have a book here by Claudio, and this is actually, it's kind of in poor shape, but it was cheap. But it's original book on grafting. Memoir on the culture of the grapevine in Sanlúcar de Barrameda. And I found there was a book on sherry by Julian Jeffs. And he gives a quote from Esteban, "From white grapes such as the Listan pressed in a good condition and gently, you get white wines without the slightest color, which are firmly distinguished by their aroma of chamomile and by their exquisite fragrance, which is so greatly appreciated by those who live in Cadiz." Do you think he drank wine? No. So, all very impressive, but how did a grass found only in North America get named after two Spaniards who never traveled to the New World? Well, guess what? We go back to the enlightened king, Carlos III, and he set out, remember, he liked botany and understanding things. He had all these worlds out there. What can they bring back to us? So he sent an expedition to Peru and Chile. That was probably when the potato came back. Sent one to Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela. What the heck? Go over to the Philippines, see what they've got. And then we come down to Mexico and surrounding areas, the Sese and Mancino expedition. And in the middle of this expedition, which you can see was very long, there was a little kerfuffle with the English in Vancouver Island. So he said, yeah, send a bunch of your people up the coast and go check out Nootka and do a study up there. So, okay, take a boat up to, you're in Mexico, you're right next door, why not go up to Nootka while you're at it, what the heck. So, it was, and these expeditions, they would start in one place, so they'd be based in Mexico City, and they would go out and study, explore an area, and then come back and compile, and then go somewhere else and compile, and so it wasn't a continuous traveling thing. So 1787 to 1803, up in the United States, we got Thomas Jefferson surely knew the Spaniards were sending all these expeditions out, and they were doing botanical stuff. Up in Canada, the English were sending expeditions out at the same time, and they were mapping. So Jefferson sent out Lewis and Clark for kind of the combined thing, map and check out the botanical. What's in this new world out west? And it was an amazing expedition. 300 new species and subspecies of plants and animals, and you read about them and the grizzly bears. I mean, pretty amazing. Okay, so Sese and Monsigno, 3,500 new species. I'd never heard of these people. 200 new genera. They sent over 7,000 herbarium sheets back to the Madrid Royal Botanical Gardens. That's a lot of sheets. And over 2,000 botanical drawings. Now, I say rediscovered in 1980. They got back 1803. Remember, we're getting close to Napoleon coming down, and then the uprising in Spain. Well, somebody took all these sheets and stashed them away, and they were missing for 150 years. And they found them, and the Carnegie Mellon Institute in Pittsburgh bought them, and you can see them online. And what are these? Well, when they went over there, they hired a couple of young guys, 17, 18-year-olds, to do their botanical garden drawings for them. And they would go out in the field and do the basic drawings of the Linnaean features. So this is basic, and you can see it's from the Turner collection of Sese and Monsigno. Just amazing that they found these. And then they would fill it out if they had time. And Echeverria, and there is a difference in spelling. The other, he's listed as having 2 R's, and the genus has 1 R. It's the 1700s, that's all right. They were also going to name the Ocotillo after him. That kind of got lost, but he did get his genus in there. So if you ever see an Echeverria, it was named after one of these illustrators. Okay, the botanical samples. Thousands of folios and samples were sent to the Madrid Royal Botanical Garden, which was set in its current location by Carlos III, and they were arranged according to the Linnaean system. It was accepted so readily. 16 years after it was published, the 10th edition, and Claudio Bouteloua became the head gardener in 1798. All the threads are coming together. One more piece to the puzzle, Mariano Lagasca. He was the one who received the samples. He worked at the Royal Botanic Garden, ultimately became its director. Poor Lagasca, he came from a wealthy family, studied medicine, and then he decided to go to botany and writing. When the revolution came around, he was on the wrong side. He fled to Europe. He fled to England, where he lived many years. He finally got back to Spain. The last, I think, 4 years of his life, he ended up back at the Royal Botanical Garden. But for now, he was working at the Royal Botanical Garden, and of course he knew the head gardener, Claudio Bouteloua. He knew his brother Esteban, who was teaching classes there. And, and by the way, one of the things, if you read about Claudio, you read that when Bonaparte came in and tried to took over Spain, he was going to bivouac his troops at the Royal Botanic Garden. And Claudio defended the garden and kept him out. So I'm picturing all these guys with their pickaxes and hoes saying, no, 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 you can't come in our backyard. I'm sure Claudio did it with words and not with hoes, but he saved the garden by defending it from the troops coming in and camping out there. So anyway, Lagasca wrote, when he was in England, he was writing an article about the gardens of Spain, And this was in English, thank goodness. And he wrote, Don Esteban Bouteloua, an enlightened man, endowed with superior genius and extraordinary diligence, devoted himself to the study of the cultivation of plants with great earnestness and success, who might have been said to have been the soul of everything done in Aranketh. Pretty nice. So Lagosca is getting all these 7,000 samples coming across his desk, named Bahia, Palafoxia, Savalia, Thermophylla, Bathyacloa, and in 1805 he named the genus Bouteloua, named for two Spanish brothers, Claudio and Esteban, horticulturalists, writers, teachers, and gardeners to kings of Spain. And that's all I got. So I don't know if there are any questions or that was a long trek back in time. Yeah.
I'd like to just share that my sister actually works at the church that Muhlenberg started in Pennsylvania.
Oh,
And some of them in the past did a bunch of historical books about the Muhlenberg family and broken them up into little things about each of the brothers and the sister, and they did a really nice treatment on about him.
yeah, I mean, it was an amazing family. And if it weren't for John Denver, I would have would never know the name Muhlenberg. And it's an earworm if you don't start thinking about the song, whatever you do. John Denver,
John Denver, Paradise.
take me down to Muhlenberg County. No, don't. All right, so I think I'm done.
Other questions? While you have her here.
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
Are Bouteloua limited to North America and Mexico, or where else are they found? That genus?
Yeah, pretty much, yes. I mean, I don't know if they go beyond Mexico. Probably, the maps don't show that. But they're mostly Rocky Mountains and down into Mexico, and then some of them are just very limited to southern United States. Yep.
Get, moved back east and planted there? I mean, because the eastern people came in.
I think the side oats grama is more widespread. I don't know how well they'll do, and they like heat. They like water. They're fine with it if you give them water, but they need a hot summer. So they have a different type of photosynthesis from the lawn grasses. From your Kentucky bluegrass uses a totally different type of photosynthesis from many of our native grasses around here. The muley grasses are designed for heat and light and can live and dry.
Are you talking for animals or
For animals, yes.
Well,
For
what are
animals.
people
I shall say palatable.
So people never adapted them for.
You probably could. I mean, no, as far as I know, just about all grasses are edible, but they usually have a husk on them that you have to remove. I think of the people in Africa doing the shaking thing. You roast them and then shake them and get rid of the chaff, so to speak. And but yeah, grasses are very edible, but you got to and that's why we try and grow our barley with bigger and corn, so it's a little easier to get rid of the chaff. Yo.
I've never seen delicate muley in a garden store or online seeds, and it is very beautiful. And is there a way to encourage it to grow in a spot that you like?
You could. It just came up in 2020 when I wrote my book. I could not find it anywhere. I looked, I could not find it. Last year it was everywhere. It was next to my driveway. Every day I would go out and take a walk. So you could pick some and shake the seeds around. Because it's just a delightful little plant. But it needed that bit of, 2020 we didn't have any monsoon. And last year we did. And this year we have fires.
Thank you. We have a round of applause. This book is available. As is our gallery is open, so I encourage you to take this opportunity to look at the exhibition that's on display there. So thank you all for coming out tonight.
Thank you.